My baby dolls, how are you doing? Snowing in the Northeast today, but we have a great show in store for you. We have the author Mitch Nathanson, who is a professor of law and professor in the Jeffrey S. Moran Center at the Study of Sports Law at the Villanova University School of Law as our guest today on Genesis. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and with me as usual is the co-captain, the co-pilot, the man with the plan, Marc Weiss.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm excited today because anytime I get to talk about a sports icon from the 1960s, I'm good to go, man. I am good to go.
And you know, Marc, we're going to find out just how much a complex character Dick Allen was because Professor Nathanson over here wrote a very detailed book about Dick Allen. The book is called God Almighty Himself, The Life and Legacy of Dick Allen. It was published last year. It is not only a biography of Dick Allen, but it is also, you could say, a literal history of sociology in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because you do learn a lot about the times, a lot about Philadelphia during those times, and how the times were changing as Dick Allen was going through his career. Of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with our producer, Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man. And again, Mitch Nathanson, who's on the show today. He's at Villanova University as a professor of law. We're trying to get his book, which he published back in 2008, how the fall of the 1977 Phillies, how a baseball team's collapse sank a city spirit. So we know, he likes Philadelphia ball. He's from, that heart of Pennsylvania. Without any further ado, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So let me ask you two questions. Number one, why Dick Allen? And number two, why did you use the phrase God Almighty Himself, who was professed by George Myatt, who was the Phillies interim manager, as the basis of the book's title?
Well, I guess I'll answer the first question first. The reason I wrote about Allen was because you also mentioned the other book I wrote about the 77 Phillies.
Yep.
And that book, I won't go into that book too much, but that book really was about how and why Philadelphians, they may love baseball, but they hate the Phillies. And how Philadelphia has always been an A's town and not a Phillies town, and how it was that if Philadelphia was always an A's town, why is it that the A's left and the Phillies stayed? And so I kind of talk about that. So that book goes back further in time than the Allen book does, and so I spent not a lot of time on Allen in that book. I think there might be a page and a half on Allen in that book. But most of the feedback I got from people was about Allen. And most of the people, they fell into two camps. And people said, and I took my discussion of Allen in that book basically from other people's portrayals of Allen. I didn't really spend a lot of time on him. And so my portrayal of Allen was pretty much like a lot of people's portrayal was that, he was a difficult guy to deal with and this all. And so some people said right on he was a pain in the neck, and other people said, boy, you just don't understand. You don't get it. And so there was enough of that on both sides that I realized, there's a lot more to this than I know. And so I started looking into it because, first of all, I was just interested, and so the more I dug, the more I found, and that's how you know you've got a good idea for a book. When you start digging and you find more and more things, you've got something that's really worthwhile. And so that's what I found, and I realized very quickly, I was really just going to write an article about it, but then I realized very quickly that there was so much there, and that it was worthy of a book, and that there hadn't been a book written about Allen. I mean, the only biography about Allen is Crash, which it was kind of written by a sports writer in the 80s. There was really no research in that book. It's a nice book to give Allen's perspectives on things, but there's no research in that book, and it's basically Allen's perspective on things, and it's fine, but it's not really a true biography of Dick Allen. So I was surprised, so I decided, hey, this is something I could do. So that's why I started researching about Allen, and the result was the book. The reason that it's titled God Almighty Himself, which is, like you say, that was a comment that Allen never said. It was a comment made by George Myatt, who was a longtime coach for the Phillies, who became interim manager in 1969 after the previous manager, Bob Skinner, walked out. He quit after Allen refused to travel to Reading for an exhibition game. And this was at the end of a long period of just a lot of battles between Allen and management. And so in his introductory press conference, this is in late August of 1969, George Myatt was kind of just dancing around the issue, and finally one member of the press asked the question everybody wanted to know the answer to, was, do you think you can handle Richie Allen? And his response was, he said, son, I don't believe God Almighty Himself could handle Richie Allen. So all I can do is try. and so that's where the title comes from, and I think it works basically on a couple of levels. It works because on the surface, but it also works on as a description of his otherworldly talents and people's perception of him as someone who viewed himself as a god, maybe, who didn't want to be treated like other people. At least that was other people's perceptions. So I just like that title for a lot of reasons.
So I just, I find Richie Allen, Dick Allen, a fascinating figure, and just by the name alone, I mean, it's like, was he Richie? Was he Dick Allen? He was a man of his times, and I think, in my opinion, if his career started in, let's say, 74 instead of 64, I don't think we'd have this conversation, because I think the treatment of him would have been a lot different. But because of the times that he grew up in the major leagues and what he went through, I think his reactions are what make your book and what make his career. Because I heard the interview, I don't know if you did the one that he did with Costas over on the MLB Network, and he seemed to be a very deep thinker about the things that were going on, and so many things happened. But do you feel that people don't really understand the blatant racism that he felt in Philadelphia? Because most people don't associate Philadelphia, with that. They'll automatically start to think about southern towns, but not realize that he did experience an awful lot of it, even in the mid to late 60s.
Well, that's true, and Philadelphia had a tough history with regard to race in baseball.
Exactly.
Probably, yeah. I mean, they had that was a tough town for Jackie Robinson.
Ben Chapman incident.
Yeah, and but actually, that was more the Phillies than the city, and I actually talk about that in the Phillies book. That the city actually, in that period, was the most integrated big city in America. And people don't realize that. Now, it became more segregated in the 50s. I don't know, I talk about in the Phillies book, but Philadelphia became a very segregated city in the 50s. But in the 40s, it was they were segregated by blocks, perhaps, the de facto segregation, but not really the large scale segregation that we've come to think of big cities and even Philadelphia. And so really, the racism that came from towards Jackie Robinson was really coming mainly from the Phillies dugout. It wasn't coming so much from the fans. Now, there were issues with the hotel that the Dodgers stayed in. So yeah, there was racism there, and there's always racism, and there's racism today. I mean, there's always racism. But Philadelphia. I don't think Philadelphia, and I'll stand up for Philadelphia here, I don't think Philadelphia is any more racist than any place else. I think that the issue with Allen was that because he was such a lightning rod, he, I believe, gave some people the feeling that they were free, people who were racist, who may not have otherwise said things, felt maybe a little more free to speak up and yell out things that they had been holding in. And by the way, we're seeing that today outside of the baseball context, and so there's always racism. And the thing is that it's the larger tenor of the times whether the people who are the true racists are going to feel as free to shout out, what they're thinking that they are they going to feel it's free to shout out what they're thinking, or are they going to keep it in? And
I
so
agree
I
with you,
yeah.
I agree with you, and I actually I'm one of those folks who I'd rather know where I stand and I'd rather know what they're thinking than have them hide it on the back end and then kind of hit you on the head somewhere down the road and you're not expecting it. So in his case, you're right. He was a lightning rod, but I don't think he minded being a lightning rod. I think he kind of reveled in it to some extent. Did you feel that way?
I don't know if he reveled in it. I mean, he was a pretty private guy and is a private guy. He's and I do spend some time in the book talking about what an introvert he is. And we didn't really, we're only now starting to understand that there are introverts and extroverts, and that introverts are not mentally ill people. But in the 60s and the 70s, the world is defined by extroverts, and extroverts believe everyone should be extroverts, but really half the population are introverts, and so an extrovert sees an introvert and sees something wrong with that person. An introvert sees an extrovert and thinks that something's wrong with that person. So, but you tend to see extroverts in the media, and you tend to see extroverts in places where they get public attention because they're extroverts. And so it's difficult for an introvert to deal with that sort of situation. And so Alan, who was an extreme introvert, he liked the attention that comes with being a superstar. And no question he liked that. But I don't think he liked a lot of the stuff that was thrown his way from people who were angry that he didn't play their game. And by that I mean people in the media who had expectations that the star of the team was going to be available at a moment's notice, and were upset when Alan wouldn't do that, and they lashed out at him. I don't think Alan liked that. So there's some of it he liked and some of it he didn't like. But as the decade went on, I think there was more that he didn't like.
Let me ask you this, Mitchell. In 1960, I think it was 3 or 4, he went to, of all places, the Philadelphia Phillies minor league team in Little Rock. And, of course, we all know what happened in 1958. President Eisenhower had to call in the National Guard. Gabe Paul, who was running the Cincinnati Reds, I speak to Gabe's daughter, pulled the team out because they wouldn't let Frank Robinson and the other black players stay in the same hotel. So here, as you mentioned, I think this was his start of where he faced racial harassment. How did he deal with this? And why did he, how did he handle it? And what in his past was able to help him overcome this?
Well, Little Rock is a fascinating story because Little Rock's not really the Deep South. The Deep South, as we understand the Deep South, you think the Deep South, you're thinking Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. But Little Rock is not the Deep South. Little Rock is like on the periphery. And Little Rock, of course, though, is really thought of as really ground zero of the Deep South, even though it really isn't, because of what happened with the school, Little Rock High School, in the late 50s. And that came about because, and I won't get too much into that because we're talking more about baseball, but that came about more about the governor, Orville Faubus, was he was a bit of a moderate. He wasn't really a far right winger, but he was being pressured on the right from members of the Klan who were going to run somebody for governor against him if he wasn't more strident against integration. And so that's why he blocked the high school as sort of a preemptive strike to help him get reelected. And that caused all the problems that it caused, obviously. But the reason that's important is because, what happened, the fallout from Little Rock was that Little Rock, the town, just had a black mark attached to it after that. And a lot of businesses pulled out of Little Rock. And very quickly, it became a place where nobody wanted to be associated with. And so, as you mentioned, the previous versions of the club there, the Arkansas Travelers, folded up, and other, the Southern Association folded as a result of that. in '63, which is when Allen went to Little Rock, there was a concerted effort to remake the image of the town. Leading the charge to that, by the way, that was Orville Faubus, who, as I said, was not he had done some, certainly a horrible thing in blocking the entrance to this high school, but the business leaders of Little Rock wanted to redeem their image, so they wanted a part of that was a new Arkansas Travelers baseball team, but this team would be integrated as part of a show of this is the new Little Rock. So the idea was to make a little integrated baseball team. The Phillies moved their AAA affiliate to Little Rock, and Dick Allen, along with Ferguson Jenkins, by the way, became the first African-American players to play in organized ball in Little Rock. Jenkins was only there for a short time. He got sent down to Double-A pretty quickly, so Allen was by himself. And so, again, here's a situation where many people in Little Rock were in favor of an integrated baseball team, but there was still a group of people. There was a Klan presence. There was the Capital Citizens, White Citizens Council, which was basically the Klan for business people. And they protested very strongly against having an integrated baseball team. They were not the majority of the people in Little Rock, but they were pretty ardent and fervent, and they could scare the hell out of you. And so that's what Allen encountered. They had integrated the hotel by that point, by the way. You mentioned that you're right, that they couldn't, the black players before could not stay in the hotels in Little Rock. That was changed for the new version of the Travelers. But for Allen, he still had to live in the black section of town because there were, he wasn't going to live with the players lived with local families. And there was no white family that was going to live, to have a black player. And so he lived in the black section of town. And so for him, Little Rock was still segregated. I mean, still Little Rock was very segregated, although it was starting to integrate. So he dealt with that, and he dealt with the catcalls from the stands. And again, I think most fans were either indifferent or supportive, but there was a vocal minority of hardcore racists who would come out and yell stuff at him and jeer him and things like that. And so that's what made it so difficult for him, because he hadn't experienced much of that before he got to Little Rock. And so the Phillies really didn't do anything to prepare him for this. They didn't, unlike Jackie Robinson, where Branch Rickey did a very good job of helping to give him a little bit of cover. The Phillies didn't do any of that, and they basically sent him down there, and he left him on his own. And it was really only his family and a couple of coaches who helped him through it, because he was thinking of quitting halfway through the season because he had enough of it.
And then after that comes 1964, and he gets to Philadelphia, and he winds up in the vortex of one of the most famous, or I guess if you're from Philadelphia, infamous pennant races of all times. It's probably the worst collapse of any team documented in history until the 2007 Mets. And he's right in the middle of that, wins the Rookie of the Year, and that season had to be a roller coaster for him as well.
Well, yeah, he had obviously a great season. He made a lot of errors at third base, but he was not a third baseman, by the way.
Right.
He had never played.
He wasn't a third baseman.
Yeah, he had never. They had put him in different positions every year in the minor leagues because he just was not a good defensive player. He's a great hitter, but he no matter where you put him, he was going to be a liability, other than first base, I guess. But in '64, the Phillies had this great season for most. For basically 5.5 months, they had a great season, and he was really him and Jim Bunning and Johnny Callison were really leading the charge. And but his honeymoon in Philly really ended before that collapse, because even while they were playing well, and this is the middle of the summer, he would speak his mind. If you would ask him a question, he would give you an answer, and not a homogenized answer. He'd give you what he thought. And so a reporter from Sports Illustrated, was covering the team because they looked like they were going to go to the World Series, and this is July, I believe. And it looked at that point like Jim Bunning would win the Cy Young, and Callison would be MVP, and Allen would be Rookie of the Year. And so they were going to do a story on that. And the reporter went to Bunning and said, "How do you feel about being possibly Cy Young Award winner?" And of course, Bunning gave basic milquetoast answer, it'd be an honor or whatever he said. Callison gave the same answer, and then they went to Allen and they said, how would you feel about being Rookie of the Year? And he said, I don't care. There's no money in it. I'm not really interested in it. I'd rather make the All-Star team because Willie Mays told me that if you do that, you get a $5,000 bonus. And fans, that got printed in Sports Illustrated, and right away there was a backlash. He was booed in Philadelphia, and this is July of '64. People assume that the booing didn't start till later, but it started then, and there was this idea that here was a young guy, a black guy, who was not accepting the hierarchy of things, wasn't responding the way people expected, and so they let him know about it.
Now, I mean, obviously, Philly fans can be a little fickle when it comes to the booing too, as we've seen over the course of sports over the years in Philadelphia. So that's nothing really new. And in this case, if he said those things today, everyone would say, yeah, it makes sense, because you go where the money is when you're an athlete. And while the Rookie of the Year is a great thing to win, if it doesn't put $1 in your pocket and you're a young struggling ball player, why would the All-Star team not be more important? Now, '64 was a turbulent year, and late in the pennant drive, they added Frank Thomas to the team to try to get them over the hump down the stretch, and while they were fading, or maybe a little bit before they were fading. Thomas and Allen had an infamous altercation. I believe it was in '65, not even in '64. What's your take on that? And do you think that not only ended the honeymoon completely, but really put Allen at a deficit with Philly fans?
Yeah, well, Thomas, like you said, Thomas was brought on board to be a pinch hitter in '64, and he was known for having a big mouth, and some people would call him a needler. Other players just basically were very upfront, saying he was just a jerk, and there's no two ways about it. And he was particularly rough on black players. And the Phillies had Allen, and then in '65 they had Johnny Briggs. So they had a few other black players, and Thomas would pick on everybody maybe a little bit, but the black players more. And Allen didn't like it. And in fact, before this, the altercation you're referring to took place on July 3rd of '65 during batting practice. But even before that, Allen had made it very clear to Thomas and to people in the media that Thomas was to leave him alone. And he said he wouldn't. If he told the media beforehand, he said, if Thomas would ever talk to me like he spoke to Johnny Briggs, I'd deck him. Because he wasn't going to put up with it. A lot of the stuff that Thomas was saying was really racially motivated. You would call it racist, I believe. I think calling Thomas a needler is just a little too gentle. And so
I think calling him a jerk is probably the most accurate thing, because if this guy was – this guy was a talented guy and a great home run hitter, and he was still available to the Mets in the expansion draft in '62. So that tells you everything you need to know about the guy, that he just wasn't good for any team's chemistry.
Yeah, it would depend, I guess, on how much you needed a guy like that. Because you're right, he could hit, but
he could hit. He only found a spot for bats.
Right. Yeah. So they do, and that's why he ended up with the Phillies. But when it came to the bigger picture, he was a pain in the neck. And so anyway, so he had altercations with Allen before, and I learned while researching the book that really this altercation began a couple of weeks earlier in Chicago and then in Los Angeles, as they were taking a road trip where Thomas would leave his bags when they got off at the hotel in Los Angeles, and he'd turn to Allen and he would say, "Take my bags, boy," stuff like that. And Allen just wouldn't put up with that, and so Thomas yelled something out to Allen during batting practice when he thought Allen had said something to him. There's a whole big story. And then Allen charged him and hit him, and Thomas responded by hitting him with a bat. And it's hard to know exactly what happened because the media at the time were all in Gene Marc's office. He was giving a press conference. And so none of the members of the media saw it. there were some fans who saw it, as the players who saw it, but the players wouldn't say anything because immediately the Phillies management put a gag order on all the players just to say not to say anything. And there weren't that many fans there, although there were a couple who I got some accounts from, but it's not too much. And what happened in the aftermath, though, was that they had this fight. And again, there had been baseball fights before, obviously. There had been interracial baseball fights before. And in fact, on the heels of this came another incident where somebody was hit with a bat. That was Juan Marichal. But in that incident, the guy who swung the bat became the villain, whereas in this one, the guy who swung the bat, Frank Thomas, was perceived as the victim. And the reason he was perceived as the victim was because while the Phillies players had a gag order on them, Thomas got released, and Thomas had no gag order, and he would talk to anybody and talk about how Allen was, he tried to apologize to Allen, and Allen cost him his job, and Allen's a bad guy, and all this stuff. And so that got played up in the media, who was looking to write about the story, but couldn't get anything from the Phillies and nothing from Allen because they couldn't talk. And so this story got spun out that Allen not only precipitated the fight, which he didn't, but then afterwards went to Phillies management and ordered them to release Thomas, which he also did not do. But that was the story that was portrayed in the local press and in the national press. And so Allen became a petulant bad guy in the aftermath of that story.
So do we blame Marc or do we blame John Quinn?
Well, you can't blame Gene Marc because Gene Marc wasn't even there, and Gene Marc's not the one who gave the gag order. It's really John Quinn, who had a horrible time dealing with Allen. He did not know how to deal with Allen, and Bob Carpenter, who owned the team, also just had no idea what to do. And really, what they should have done is they should have. If this happened today, there would be a press conference and people would talk about it and we would find out what happened. But back then, nobody said anything, and it really spiraled out of control. I believe the reason it was John Quinn who put the gag order on Allen specifically. And I believe the reason he put the gag order on Allen was because of the comments, the fallout from the comments that Allen had made the year before about the All-Star game or about being Rookie of the Year. And so he didn't want another one of those sorts of things. So he said, better for Allen not to say anything, which of course was the worst thing you could have done.
Let me ask you this question, Mitch. The whole, not a lot of people remember. You always hear about Curt Flood. In fact, I put it up on my Negro League site today. Not a lot of people remember that Dick Allen was one of the people who were going to go from Philly to St. Louis. And Marc was telling me before, and of course you mentioned it in the book, that Allen was writing in the dirt at first base, trade me, boo, whatever. But let me ask you, why is there such a contrast where, he was willing to go to St. Louis, it's a better team, he's getting out of Philly, Allen, but Flood refused to go, and he took it to a court. Why do we revere Curt Flood so much when he did the same thing as Allen would do, and even on one national, grandstand?
That's a great question.
It's a fascinating question, and as I write in the book, Curt Flood said the words that ultimately set the players free, but Dick Allen lived them, and Allen throughout the '60s was experiencing everything Curt Flood didn't want to experience by being traded to Philadelphia, and he would say it throughout the '60s. Curt Flood didn't say much. Curt Flood, as you said, he's in St. Louis and he's being treated relatively well there, and he's being paid relatively well, at least based upon the standards of the day. And Curt Flood didn't become a baseball radical as we think of him until that trade. Allen, though, was talking for years about the inequality, salary inequality, and how awful it was that either you can't get traded out of town when you want to, or you can get traded out of town when you don't want to, and how that just isn't fair. And so Allen was saying all of these things well before Curt Flood even thought of them. And as a matter of fact, in Curt Flood's letter to Bowie Kuhn when he announces that he wants himself declared a free agent. He is saying a lot of the same words, word for word, that Dick Allen said months earlier, and he got them from Dick Allen. And when Kurt Flood says, "I'm not a piece of chattel," Allen said that a few months before when he's trying to get out of Philadelphia, and so really, Flood is an extension of Allen, and when he was being traded to Philadelphia, Kurt Flood initially refused the trade, not because he wanted to make a statement, but because he didn't want to go to Philadelphia and be the next Dick Allen, and that's what he said initially. And, later it became a bigger deal, and he actually said later, well, no, it was nothing to do with Philadelphia. It has to do with this bigger issue. That's not true. It had to do with him going to Philadelphia. And then it later became a bigger issue, and then he spoke about it in bigger terms. But really, Allen's the guy who gets lost in all this, because Allen is the one, if there's no Dick Allen, there's no Kurt Flood. And everything is different. And so that's the thing that's why your question is such a good question, because I think you're right that without everything that happened in Philadelphia, the history of baseball with regard to the reserve clause and all that stuff that we know in the 70s would all be different.
Do you think that maybe the public persona of the two players is why it gets twisted the way it does? Because Flood always struck me as a very soft-spoken, articulate guy who was so smart and well-worded. I wish I could put my words together as well as he did. Like, I've seen the interviews that he did for Ken Burns' baseball series, and maybe because of the way he worded things and because the media was behind him, that he had that much more clout, whereas Allen was at war with the media, and as we all know, if you're at war with the media, it's a tough road to get your point across and not look like a bad guy.
Well, I think the difference between Allen and Flood, the main difference was I do believe that Kurt Flood saw the bigger picture, and Allen never did.
Agreed.
And so, yeah, it's like I said earlier, I am 100% convinced that if Kurt Flood was traded to any other ball club, he would have gone. It was only Philadelphia he didn't want to go to. But I'm also convinced that very quickly Flood understood that what he was doing was bigger than Philadelphia, and that's why he changed his tone and became more of a crusader, because he saw the big picture. Allen never saw the big picture, and really, it's interesting that as these things were taking place in the early 70s, as Flood's case is winding through the Second Circuit and then going up to the Supreme Court, there were writers in the black press, not so much in the white press, which really ignored Allen with regard to this angle, but in the black press, there were writers who were understanding that there was a connection between Allen and Flood, and they would try to talk to Allen about it. And Allen would never acknowledge the connection, and in fact, he would often try to distance himself from Flood. In fact, he would often say, "I've got nothing. I have respect for Kurt Flood and everything he's done, and I wish him well." He said, "But that's not my fight. Flood is fighting for free agency. All I wanted was to get the hell out of Philadelphia." And so Allen always distanced himself from that, and he never saw Flood's fight as his fight. And
don't you think though, for Flood though, arguably toward the end of his career, his baseball card, was long, and there was a lot of great stuff on the back of it and a lot of accomplishments, whereas Allen was this rising superstar at this point. So he had more to lose personally, Allen did, and more to gain personally, whereas with Flood, do you think that that's one of the reasons why he realized it was a bigger movement, because he knew that the career for him was, he was on the downside?
Yeah, that's true. Allen was, I think he was 27 or when
he was just hitting his prime.
Yeah, and as one sports writer, I think it was Larry Merchant, told me, he said, back then superstars weren't traded, in their prime. No. And, you can think here and there, you can think of an exception here and there. Frank Robinson was traded, but he was considered an old 30. That's why he was traded. He wasn't thought to be. Now, it turned out he wasn't in his prime.
That's what they said.
Right, but he turns out he was in his prime. But
he was in his prime, but they didn't like the fact that him and Vada Pinson were influencing Pete Rose in Cincinnati, and they used that as an excuse.
Right, and so, but I think that if Robinson was a few years younger, they may have put up with it. But they thought he was a disruptive force, I believe, and they thought he was older, so they got rid of him. But
yeah, he disrupted the Orioles to a lot of championships.
Right, as it turned out, it was idiotic thinking. But I do think that Allen, like you're right, Allen was in his prime, and those guys, with very rare exception, don't get traded. And
no.
And so if you think back upon how difficult it is for a player to move on his own before free agency, it sort of puts all the things that he did, particularly in 68 and 69, in a different light. If you want out of a very bad situation, what are you going to do? And particularly when the Phillies are not paying you what you would be paid if you were somewhere else. If you were in Los Angeles, for example, or New York, you would get paid a lot more money than you would if you're in Philadelphia. And so what are you going to do if you want out of Philadelphia? There's nothing you can do other than what he tried to do was try to make himself as disruptive as possible to get himself out of the city, which, eventually, and even that took him 2 years.
Let me ask you this question, Mitch. So he played for the Cardinals and Dodgers for a year, and then he was traded to the White Sox. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think that Chuck Tanner's low-key styling of handling the ball players, as opposed to, say, what's his name, Austin, and on the Dodgers and the managers before him, made it possible for Dick Allen to thrive in Chicago?
Chuck Tanner, I believe, he's the equivalent of what we would think of Joe Madden today. He understood the players. He understood that these guys were adults. They were grown men, and you were to treat them like adults and not like children. And that was the thing that, if there was one thing Allen rebelled against, it was being treated like a child. And Chuck Tanner would always say, this is even before Allen showed up, he said, I don't have one set of rules. I have 25 sets of rules. Whatever the individual needs, that's, whatever works for him, I'm good with that, because the ultimate goal here is to win as many games as possible, and we win as many games as possible if everybody is performing at their best. So if Allen doesn't want to take batting practice and that makes him play better at game time, why should I make him take batting practice? Today, everybody does that. But, you go back 4 decades, and there was a lot of institutional control of these guys. And Chuck Tanner was one of the first guys to understand that if you kind of laid off a little bit and let these guys who know their bodies better than anybody else and know what they need to do to prepare, let them handle it, you can get better results. And so when Allen came to Chicago, the first thing Chuck Tanner said was, look, show up at game time, and whatever you do before game time and after game time, as long as it doesn't impact what you're doing during the game, it's fine with me. And Allen took to that very quickly. And, yeah, I do believe Chuck Tanner – and Chuck Tanner also had a family connection to Allen. He grew up in Newcastle, western Pennsylvania, right near Wampum, where Allen grew up. And he knew Allen's family, and he knew his older brothers. And so he knew Allen's upbringing. He was familiar with Allen since he was a kid, and knew what a special player and, a different sort of a person that he was, and he treated him like an individual. And, it's no coincidence that the first year in Chicago, he's MVP of the American League, and he leads a White Sox team which, in retrospect, if you look back, almost was able to complete one of the biggest upsets in baseball history, in that they almost beat the 72 Oakland A's. When you look at those Oakland A's teams, we understand them now as the last really great dynasty in baseball. And the 72 White Sox almost beat them. And a lot of that is because of Chuck Tanner and really Dick Allen.
Would you say that he considered the years that he played in Chicago that the most fulfilling or the happiest years of his career? Because obviously he came out of Philadelphia where the honeymoon period, as you said, ended somewhere toward the middle part of his rookie season, and then that team just kind of imploded year after year. It just got worse and worse as he was there and he wanted out. and then he did those pit stops in St. Louis and in LA. He finally gets to Chicago. Is that the happy time for him? Is this where, this is where we see the real Dick Allen? Because that's when you start to hear his name change, right? Like now he's Dick Allen, he's not Richie, which Richie signifies being a kid. Like he's a grown man and being treated like one.
Well, when the White Sox traded for Allen in '72, the first thing that they did when they sent him the contract was they put Dick Allen on the contract, not Richie. And they said from now on, we'll call you Dick Allen. I mean, everybody knew that he preferred Dick rather than Richie from the time he was in the minor leagues. Yet there was a lot of it was a hierarchy. There was a hierarchy of there were the sports writers who considered themselves above the players, and so the sports writers anointed a player with a name, and then the player was not supposed to say anything about it. And when a rookie or a minor leaguer says, "I don't like that name," all that's going to do is make the veteran sports writer angry and just use Richie more and more and more. And so it was a lot of petty things like that. And then when he gets to Chicago, a lot of what the White Sox do very well is they try to get rid of a lot of that. And that's why they say, we're going to call you Dick. We're going to let you do your own thing. We're going to let you come and go as you please. And yeah, I do believe that for a couple of years at least, he has some great years, but he also is happier there. But then again, even in, we get to 74 and, things are starting to implode again. And the reason things implode in 74 is because, when you treat somebody differently, everybody's okay with it when you're winning. But then when you start to not be as successful, people look for scapegoats, and they say, well, how come Allen didn't show up for batting practice? Well, Allen didn't show up for batting practice in 72 when they were almost winning the division. That's got nothing to do with why they're not winning in 74. The fact is, the White Sox of those years were not that good. They had a great year in 72, sort of like the 64 Phillies, and then they kind of came back down to where they really belonged, and, people started just picking on Allen again because, well, here's the superstar, and he's, not doing everything all the other players are doing, and so it must be his fault. They're looking for cause and effect. Well, there is no cause and effect.
Honestly, if you look at their stats, they weren't that great in 72 either. Just Chuck Tanner got the most out of them.
Yeah, they played over their heads. They were not a great team, and they played over their heads for about 5 months, and then at the end they kind of fell apart a little bit. But yeah, they played way over their heads for a long time, and they almost beat a team which is an all-time team, which is saying something.
Let me ask you this question, Mitchell. A lot of people on the south side of Chicago credit Allen with saving the franchise for Chicago. There was talk at the time that they're going to be traded. The team's going to move to St. Petersburg or Seattle, because Seattle was really pulling for a team at the time since the Pilots has left. Do you agree that Allen helped popularize the White Sox amongst its fans again during his tenure?
Yeah, well, I spoke to Roland Heeman, and I spoke to John Allen, who was the owner of the club. I spoke to his son, and they both say, without a doubt, without Dick Allen, that team is gone. And they were not drawing at all. If you look at their attendance, before Allen arrived, they were at the bottom of the American League. And when he showed up, their attendance spiked. And by the way, as soon as he leaves after 74, they bottom out again. Those years where it was not quite clear that the White Sox could remain in Chicago, they needed a drawing card, and so Allen became that attraction. And by the way, it's another thing that ultimately irked Allen, and it irked him in Philadelphia, and ultimately irked him in Chicago, was that he was aware that he's being used as a drawing card, and people didn't really understand why that bothered him so much. But it's interesting. I'm working on a book now about Jim Bouton, and Bouton was the same way. And I spoke to some sports writers about that, and they had an interesting take on why this was such an issue for both Allen and also Jim Bouton. And they said, what they said was illuminating. They said, here's guys that do not make a lot of money. Go back to the pre-free agency years. These guys are not making a lot of money. Now, Allen was making more than most, but even there, he wasn't making as much as the owner of the team was making, and he wasn't making as much as most of the people in management were making. And so they are around a lot of people who are making money. but they're not making money, or as much as they think they should make. And if you're an introspective, smart person, you start to realize this doesn't make any sense. Everybody around me is making money largely because of me, and yet I'm not seeing the money. And so Allen was very aware of that. Allen would always say this in Philadelphia, and he said it in Chicago, that I'm being used as a drawing card here, and yet all the money is going into other people's pockets. And he rebelled against that, rightfully so. And, that's not the case today because we have free agency. But you got to think back into the free agency era, the pre-free agency era, and understand that the smarter, more intuitive ball players were well aware that they were really being used for other people's profits, and that bothered them. And I think that's ultimately what soured Allen on Chicago, because I think at some point every year he saw attendance was going up, there was more money being made from parking and concessions, and yet he was making the same. He was doing well comparatively, but he was not making what anywhere near what ownership was making or pulling in. So it bothered him.
How did he feel about playing those 2 seasons with his brother? Was that something that you researched or heard about, or was that just something that most people that just kind of like fell by the wayside? Did that help him acclimate to being in Chicago too, because he had a family member with him, someone who knew him?
Well, yeah, Roland Heeman specifically reached out and signed his brother Hank, who at that point was out of baseball. He'd been out of baseball for a couple of years, and he was never much of a player. He played for the Senators for a few years, and he was a utility kind of guy.
He was an outlier for the Senators, who weren't good.
Yeah, and so he was never much of a player, and he was even out of baseball. But to help make Dick feel more comfortable, Heeman and Tanner reached out to Hank and put him on the roster. And so I did talk to players from that 72 team and asked them, what did you feel about that? Here's a guy that probably on merit wouldn't be there. Did it bother you at all? And to a man, they all said no, it didn't bother them because, look, the 25th man on the team has an interesting role anyway. They're usually there for some weird reason. Maybe they're there because he's a particular pitcher's personal catcher, or he's a particularly good, left-handed reliever who can get one guy out, or he's a pinch hitter who's only good in certain situations. So we didn't look at Hank as any differently. He couldn't really play that well, but he made our best player better. And
right,
so
and the 25th man never loses a pennant for a team.
Right, and so they said, yeah, this guy's not going to hurt us on the field, and he makes our best player better, and so he makes us better, and so we were fine with him. Now, the medical staff hated Hank Allen because, and I did speak to the team doctor who had a big altercation with Allen in '74. He did not like Hank Allen because he felt that Dick hid behind Hank, and if you wanted to talk to Dick, you had to talk to Hank. And again, this is basically because Dick didn't like dealing with people he didn't want to deal with. So Hank basically became somewhat of his personal secretary. And so if you needed to talk to Dick, you talked to his brother, and his brother would see if he can get you on his calendar. And if you were the team doctor and you were used to just dealing with the players one-on-one, you didn't like this. And so, 40 years later, this doctor is still angry at Dick and Hank Allen for this reason.
I think he needs to get over it.
Yeah, he was pretty angry. I guess he felt like as a medical professional, he has a level of independence, and therefore he shouldn't have to go through this third party. And he also felt, he actually got fired at the end of the '74 season because of injury issue with Allen. And so there's all sorts of issues there about he felt that, the White Sox threw him under the bus and all this sort of thing. But, there's a lot of bad feelings there. But ultimately, I do think that the players, at least, they didn't mind Hank. And, Dick liked having him there. And he was really a non-issue for the players. And again, the fans, most of them probably didn't even notice Hank Allen was on the team.
Let me ask you this question, Mitchell. He breaks his leg, I think, in '74, and his contract, Allen's contract, sold to the Braves. He refuses to go to the Braves. But why did Philly coax him out of retirement with all the trouble that they had with him a decade before?
Yeah, that's interesting because he definitely did not want to go back to Philadelphia. And the way the story was spun in Philadelphia in '75 when he comes back was that this was a mutual thing. And it was not a mutual thing. He did not want to go back to Philadelphia. What he really wanted to do was go back to Chicago. But he basically quit the team in the middle of September and announced his retirement, but really didn't want to retire. And there were a lot of reasons I go into in the book as to why he quit. But he quit, and that angered, obviously, the front office, and even Chuck Tanner at that point said, that's it. I can't, we can't continue on. And so the White Sox sell his contract to the Braves, and Allen does not want to go to the Braves because he doesn't want to go back to the South, where he had such a bad experience in Little Rock. And he got a lot of bad press about that. But, remember, go back in time and remember what's going on in Atlanta in 1974, right? This is the season that just ended. Hank Aaron has just broken a Babe Ruth home run record and received all sorts of death threats. And Hank Aaron didn't make much of those death threats publicly. He didn't say a lot about them. We know about them now, but there wasn't much made about them then. Most people were not aware of that. Allen was. Allen knew about that. And Allen knew that this was going back to the South. And for him, people were talking about Atlanta as being the new South, but all he saw was, well, this is Little Rock, but, a little further to the east. And so he didn't want to go back. So the thing was, though, he's stuck because he's the property of the Braves. He doesn't want to play there. He wants to play for the White Sox, but they don't want him. And nobody else in baseball will touch him because at this point, he quit on the White Sox. He's now a little older, and most teams think, well, he's an older ball player. He's got a lot of baggage. It's not worth the risk. And only the Phillies reach out to him, and the reason they reach out to him really is because the ownership changed from father to son. Bob Carpenter, who had such a horrible time with Allen, is gone. His son Rulli fashioned himself not a progressive, but more progressive. And it's kind of a George W. H.W. Bush sort of thing where the son's trying to outdo the father a little bit. And Rulli Carpenter has it in his head that if he can bring Allen back and make peace with Allen, he can kind of cement his own reputation as the benevolent owner of the Phillies. And he said a lot of things. Well, if I had more involvement with Allen in the 60s, things wouldn't have gone so badly. And so he convinces management, who does not want to sign Allen at all, to go after him, and so they eventually convince him that he has no other choice. It's Philly or nothing, and Allen ultimately wants to play ball, so he agrees to go back to Philadelphia. Although, again, the Phillies want him more than Allen wants to go back to Philadelphia at that point.
Did his second experience in Philadelphia turn out to be a better one for him? Did it heal a lot of the old wounds, or was it just a little bit more of the same, or he was a declining player at that point and maybe it didn't matter? I don't know.
Well, initially things go well off the field for him. So, he missed spring training. He shows up. He's older. It takes you a little longer to get into game shape at that point. So he doesn't show up. The Phillies don't sign him until May. So not only has he missed spring training, he's missed April. And he shows up. He's not really ready to play. But things do go well off the field. He gets a huge standing ovation when he comes back. He doesn't have a good year. He doesn't hit very well. But he's not booed. And in fact, he gets standing ovations most of the times he comes to the plate, even though he's not really playing all that well. And really the reason why he gets all these standing ovations is because I think a lot of people in Philadelphia realize, the world had changed between 1969 and 1975. A radical shift had been undertaken in just that short period of time. And I think a lot of people realized when they look back upon what had happened with them and Allen, that they were on the wrong side of history. And I think just like Rulli Carpenter, I think a lot of fans really went overboard in Philadelphia to welcome him back because they wanted to make amends. And so things on the field don't go so well, but off the field they go really well. And the press treats him well. The fans treat him well. The Phillies play better. They finished second place that year. But at the end of the season, Rulli Carpenter wants to release Allen because he figures he's done his job. Things worked out well. Allen should just retire and everybody should be, happy with everything. But Allen wants to play some more because he had a bad year and he wants to prove that he's not finished. So there was a lot of pressure to bring him back for 76, which they do. And then, the Phillies play well, but then things sort of fall apart at the end of the season when Allen starts to have some more issues and with the press and he has an injury and things sort of devolve by the time the Phillies get to the postseason against the Reds. Allen took a stand in support of a teammate of his, Tony Taylor, who again, most people don't remember this, but the Phillies, like a lot of teams, had segregated spring training in the early 60s, and the black players were on their own, or the dark-skinned players were on their own. And Tony Taylor took Allen under his wing, and all the black players under his wing, and he found housing for them. He helped cook. He cooked for them. He did a lot of things to protect them, and Allen never forgot it. And so in '76, this is the end of Tony Taylor's career. He's really at that point a de facto coach. He doesn't really do much. But Allen says, Tony Taylor deserves to be on the postseason roster, and if the Phillies don't put him on there, I'm not playing. And it didn't make any sense in a baseball sense to put Tony Taylor on the postseason roster. He hadn't really played all that much. But Allen said, look, if you're not going to put Tony Taylor, my friend who's done so much for me, on the roster, then don't put me on the roster either. And Allen was their starting first baseman. So that caused a huge commotion. And eventually the Phillies and Allen kind of reached a compromise where, Allen would be in uniform but inactive, which is what he was going to be anyway. And Allen is kind of okay with that. But that leads to Dave Cash and Mike Schmidt during the Reds postseason series refusing to take batting practice because they trying to divert attention away from Allen to them. And that just causes a whole other issue. And so the Phillies are in chaos by the time they reach the Reds, a team they probably weren't going to beat anyway.
I was going to say, that was a pretty strong Dynasty Reds team, so.
Yeah, they were probably not going to beat the Reds. But don't forget, the Phillies won 101 games. They were a good team. They were not as good as the Reds.
And they were on the upswing at that point.
Right, but they were going to have a tough time against the Reds anyway. But you add in all the distractions that came as a result of the Taylor incident and Schmidt and Cash and all the other stuff. They had no chance, and so of course they get swept.
Let me ask you this, Mitch. Bottom line: Dick Allen, Hall of Fame or no?
I think he's a Hall of Famer because I think anybody who's dominant in the game for an era is a Hall of Famer. And he was the dominant, if not the dominant, he would say one of the 3 or 4 most dominant hitters in his era, 64 to 74. I mean, there's only a few players you can put in that group that match him. And I think the reason he's kept out, there's 2 reasons he's kept out. He's not kept out because of the lack of great years. He's kept out because of the lack of mediocre years. He doesn't have a lot of mediocre years that kind of sandwich around his great years. He kind of started on the scene and was fantastic for a decade, and then he fell off the table, baseball skills-wise. Mm-hmm. So if you look at his numbers, his baseball card numbers, they don't match up with some other players, but those other players, they had a lot of mediocre years and Allen didn't. So if you really think about it, Allen's kept out because he wasn't mediocre for long enough.
He didn't have those collector years.
Yeah, he didn't have those years at the end where you just add up the stats, the Derek Jeter years. He had a lot of those years where Allen didn't have those.
He didn't have those 290, those 280, 290, 22 home run, 87 RBI years.
Right. If you have 5 or 6 of those, you put those numbers together with his, and you've got a guy who's got almost 500 home runs, and you've got numbers where you really can't argue. The other reason he's kept out is I think people will argue the numbers, but the real reason that he's kept out really is because of a perception of his attitude. And so I don't believe that the attitude, should be counted against him, but I also think more to the point, people really need to take reevaluate that and think about, well, why did things unravel or occur the way they did? And, you mentioned in the beginning of the show that if he came around in the 70s, he wouldn't have had all these issues, to which I agree. However, I would say that if there was no Dick Allen in the 60s, then we wouldn't have had that next era. or it would have taken a longer time for that next era to arrive. So you needed a guy who was going to stand up and say, I'm just not going to be treated like this. And that guy is going to take a lot of bullets. And Allen took a lot of bullets for a lot of guys who came after him.
I think that the writers just
fights.
had an issue with him. I think it was the writers more who had an issue with him with these things than the fans did. And I think, unfortunately, the fans don't vote and the players don't vote for their peers. It's the Baseball Writers Association guys who vote, and a lot of them are old and set in their ways, especially back when he was eligible.
Well, yes, if you look at, like I brought up Marichal before, right? So Marichal was the guy who hit Johnny Roseboro with the bat. Now, Marichal was kept out of the hall.
Roseboro forgave him, and the writers didn't.
Right. Well, so the Marichal was kept out of the hall his first couple of years of eligibility because of that incident. And basically the writers really forced him into this very public contrition. And John Roseboro had to publicly forgive him, and Marichal had to say he was sorry 20 different ways. And then after he, basically genuflected enough, the writers said, okay, now you're in. And they elected him in. Allen would never do that. And to this day, he won't do it. And a lot of people have said, if Allen would just come out and talk about what he did and why he did and say he was sorry, people would forgive him. And Allen's like, I have nothing to be sorry about and nothing to forgive. I don't need to say I'm sorry because I didn't do it. I wouldn't have done anything differently. And this is true.
I agree.
Even today, as now we're talking about, the golden era or whatever they call those veterans committees, he will not campaign on his own behalf. And people say that hurts his candidacy, and his response is, I don't care. I'm either going to get in based on my numbers or I'm not, and I'm not going to sit here and beg. And to this day, I think that bothers some people. And, people who are bothered by that ought to look at why they're bothered by it instead of looking at it.
It actually makes me like him more, to be honest, that he won't be contrite and kiss their rear ends because he shouldn't have to. He performed on the field and posted these great numbers and did what he did, and all they did was sit there and try to write about it and tear the guy down. So why should he have to kiss their butts?
Right, that's how he views it, and it hurt him. It certainly has hurt him in terms of his legacy. And that's why part of the subtitle is The Life and Legacy of Dick Allen, because
maybe it hurts the Hall of Fame more by not having him in there, to be honest.
Yeah, I think people don't really understand the story. They don't understand that this was not a guy who was, a jerk. This is a guy who felt he wasn't being treated the same as other ball players with similar skills. He saw that Mickey Mantle, who had his own issues, as we learned, the press would cover for him. You never heard about Mickey Mantle being drunk on the bench. You never heard about any of these things. But we
didn't hear about it until Ball 4.
You didn't hear about it until Ball 4, but you heard about it about Dick Allen in the 60s. In fact, I went through, the coverage of Allen throughout the 60s. There was a lot of talk about Allen's drinking in the 60s. Listen, he wasn't the only guy who drank. And but you heard about it with Dick Allen constantly. You never heard about Mickey Mantle until Boughton wrote it in Ball 4. And that's one of the things that bothered Allen. He's like, well, how come everything I do is written up in the papers, but when Mickey Mantle does it, it's covered up. And so that's, he talks about being treated differently. He's like, well, yeah, I want to be treated like Mickey Mantle. Why don't you treat me like Mickey Mantle? And that bothered him.
Let me just say, Mitchell, it was fantastic to have you on the show to talk about Dick Allen. I hope you had a fantastic time, just like Marc and myself did.
Can you tell I had a good time?
I had a great time. It was a lot of fun.
I had a great time,
talk about Dick Allen.
And I want to get your 77 book, talk about the Phillies. I know you contacted Dick Allen when you were putting this together, but I don't think he granted you an interview. But between your interviews and the research, the newspapers, and the primary sources, how long did it take you to put this together and finally get a manuscript going for it?
It took about 3 years. The whole thing was about 3 years from start to finish. Yeah, you're right. Allen wouldn't speak to me for the book Although now, he realizes I'm not such a terrible guy, and so now I've had contact with him since, and so that's he's just a very he's a very maybe a little suspicious, personal, an introvert. Doesn't really let a lot of outsiders into his circle, so it was understandable that he didn't want to speak to me, and that was fine. But since the book's come out, I've become somewhat friendly with his son, and his son came up to me at one event and said, "Did you grow up in my house somehow and I didn't see you?" So that was nice to hear, and my understanding is that there's nothing in the book that I think he would disagree with. That's my understanding, and so that made me feel good to hear that.
Just for
where can we find
my top 10 list of people who should be in the Hall of Fame?
Definitely.
Where can we find God himself, not himself, the life and legacy of Dick Allen, besides Amazon, Barnes & Nobles? Where else can we find this amazing book?
Well, anywhere books are sold, which I think is nowhere, right? I don't think
But not anymore. Not anymore. But I'm going to end the show like this, as I always do. I want you to hold the line even after you hear the show end. Mitch, I got a couple of questions to ask you. Folks, this is a very, very good book, a very complex character, as you saw and heard, by Mitchell Nathanson. His study of Dick Allen is second to none. It is well researched. Go out and buy this book. It's really a treat to read. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz, and along with Marc Weiss and our guest today, Mitchell Nathanson, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck. We'll see you next time.